There is a place, not here or there, but somewhere in between. There is a space in the thin air that really can't be seen. If you listen and observe, you may be surprised. Some may call it Camelot or even paradise. Some may say you cross a bridge, others through a door. But all I know about this place is that I call it Evermore. Evermore.
Good evening, sweet spirits. Welcome to the show. My name is Suzanne Sorrell, and I'm the host of the Evermore Paranormal Network. On this episode, we're going to talk about Victorian mourning rituals. So let's get started. So, in the 19th century, Americans were preoccupied with death. Death was celebrated. The topic of death was openly discussed. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861 in December. This sent Queen Victoria into deep mourning, and she started wearing black, and she started declaring things in honor of Prince Albert. And so this is where the Victorian style of mourning the dead began. Mourning the dead served a purpose. It brought families together. It gave people time to grieve, and it allowed them to show respect for their deceased loved ones. So the first part of this is, what's a good death? The art of dying. A good death would be at home, in bed. The dying person would be the center of attention, surrounded by their family, friends, clergy, and doctors. They'd be giving their final farewells and blessings to one another, and they would pray for a good death. Once the person passed away, the next phase of the process was the wake. In Victorian America, the news of a loved one's death sent everyone into immediate mourning. The announcement of death would be put on stationery that was trimmed and bordered in black, and they'd be hand-delivered. The house would be decorated to indicate that a death had also occurred. Windows would be draped in black crepe. Doorways were decorated with flowered, covered black wreaths. Black crepe would be hung outside of the home with ribbons tied to the crepe, indicating an adult's death, which would be black ribbons, or white ribbons would indicate a child's death. Blinds were drawn and shutters were closed. Mirrors were turned inward or covered with black material because Victorians were very superstitious. Clocks were stopped at the time of death and restarted after the burial. The body would be placed in viewing in the family parlor of the home. And as long as the body remained in the home would be kept quiet and calm. The next step would be the funeral. Funeral services were held at the home of the deceased or in a church. If the deceased was an adult, the hearse would be draped in black. If the deceased was a child, the hearse would be adorned with white ribbons and accents and the child would have a white coffin, and the mourners would wear white gloves. The ceremony was led by a family member, friend, or undertaker. After the ceremony, the pallbearers would carry the coffin out of the house or the church and directly to the waiting hearse or gravesite. The body was always removed from the house or church, feet first, another superstition. The deceased would be taken to the cemetery for a final viewing and a few brief words or prayers. After the funeral, a traditional light meal would be served at the home of the deceased, the home of the widow. There would be a funeral tea or dinner, depending on their economic circumstances. Several common baked goods were served. There were funeral pies, funeral biscuits or cookies, and funeral cakes or muffins. And I'm going to have an episode later on where I actually prepare these items for the show and taste them. The next step of the process, obviously, we were at the cemetery. Now, prior to the 1830s, graveyards were considered undesirable places for the living to visit. Cemeteries were in churchyards, or they were in private family plots. But after the 1830s, large rural cemeteries on the outskirts of towns and cities started popping up. They were public garden-like, park-like cemeteries, making the visit to the cemetery more pleasant. They would have gardens, ponds, fountains, and elaborate monuments and tombstones. Now, I mentioned the undertaker earlier. In the early years, family handled everything prior to the Victorian era, before death was the focus. Family and friends would handle all matters of the funeral. Then there was the emergence of the undertaker, who would come to the home of the deceased and handle everything, to include embalming, which was used to slow down the body decomposition until burial. So now I want to talk about coffins and caskets during that time period. In the early 19th century, coffins and caskets were custom made by cabinet makers. Wooden boxes were hexagonal shaped at the head, such as this example here, and tapered at the feet. This is just a coffin for a doll. It's not authentic or anything. I just wanted to show you the shape. The coffins were made of pine, cedar, poplar, or mahogany, and the lids were screwed on. They were rubbed down with beeswax and polished with a hot iron because varnishing took too long to dry. Decorative metallic handles and plates were added. In 1848, the first metallic coffin was introduced, and it had a glass plate on the top to enable one to view the face of the deceased. Again, another superstition. Victorians were afraid that they'd be buried alive, so they wanted that to be able to be seen. In the 1860s, coffins were being made more pleasing to look at with ornate decorations. Some even came with a key to lock it shut before burial because there was a problem of grave robbers. Some had alarm systems, bells, air tubes, flags, because again, Victorians were terrified of being buried alive. Eventually, caskets replaced coffins because caskets, as we know today, are rectangular in shape and easier to stack and ship. So, epitaphs. Epitaphs are inscriptions on headstones. In Victorian times, the rule was that epitaphs were to be expressive but brief. You may have heard some of these. Absent, but not dead. They are not dead. And I've used these next ones a few times. Gone, but not forgotten. I may put that one on mine. We will meet again, and gone home. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk about the stages of mourning and mourning attire. So stay tuned. So welcome back. Now I'm going to talk to you about stages of mourning. Mourning etiquette was dictated by one's relationship to the departed. There were set time frames for mourning. A widow, for instance, would mourn her husband for 2.5 years. A widower, however, would mourn for his wife only 3 months. A mother for her child, 1 year. A child for a parent, 1 year. To mourn grandparents or siblings, 6 months. To mourn an aunt or uncle, 3 months. And to mourn a friend that left you an inheritance, 6 months. So now we're going to talk about mourning attire. First, let's talk about what women had to wear. Wearing mourning attire was a way of paying tribute and honoring the deceased. Women wore what were called widow's weeds, which were the dresses, and weeping veils, which were the veils and bonnet, which I have one here. Basically, women wore black from head to toe, except their underpinnings, which are the clothing under the top that you see, the top coat. In general, the dresses were made of crepe, and over time, the crepe would turn a rusty color and become shabby and limp, hence the term widow's weeds. Now, there were several stages of mourning for women. You know, they're in mourning for their spouse for 2.5 years. So the first stage is called first mourning. It's also called deep, full, or fresh mourning. This period encompassed the first year. Mourning dresses were simple, trim of black braiding and velvet, or no trim at all. And a mourning bonnet was black, made of crepe, cotton, or some other fabric. And like I said earlier, this is a mourning bonnet. It's a reproduction. It's got the bonnet and it's got the satin veil. But the weeping veil was made of black or fine silk. The length of the veil was from the crown of the bonnet to mid-calf or shorter. Little or no jewelry would be worn during this period. Suede or cotton black gloves were worn. Handkerchiefs were used with a black border only. Note that underpinnings and handkerchiefs were not dyed black due to the toxicity of the dye. So anything that touched the skin, a handkerchief to your face or the underpinnings which would touch your body, they weren't dyed black because they were toxic at the time. The second stage of mourning is called second mourning or lighter mourning. During this period, this was the year following the first year, this period, and the weeping veil would be set aside. Black collars, cuffs, and sleeves were replaced with white, and the trim became black lace. Now the next stage is called ordinary mourning. Now, you know, that it's been much longer period since their spouse or whoever has passed. Now they're using shiny black silks, grays, violets, and whites that are incorporated into the dresses. And now it's okay to have a piece of mourning jewelry added to your ensemble. And the last stage is called half mourning. This is where the widow is now introduced to society. Some widows choose to remain in mourning until their own death. And widows are less likely to remarry than widowers during this time period. And it was considered bad luck to keep mourning clothes in the house after you came out of mourning. So, what did the men have to wear during mourning? Men had far less restrictions on their attire than women. A black suit, worn for 3 months, was sufficient. Some men, however, also wanted to, they would wear a black crepe armband on their left arm. Other men would wear black stoles or sashes called shoulder scarves. And there was also something that was kind of relevant to the women had the weeping veils and the men had the weeper. And the weeper was a black crepe headband that was put around their hat with black streamers attached to it. So, children. Children are in mourning also, but the restrictions aren't as much, obviously. But children under the age of 12, they would wear white in the summer and gray in the winter. And what they would do, or their mother, would sew black ribbons, buttons, sashes, and belts to their clothing. And sometimes they would go as far as putting black trim on the clothing of their children. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk to you about how the Victorians remembered the dead. Welcome back. Now I'm going to talk to you about how Victorians remembered the dead. One way was through post-mortem photography. In the mid-19th century, there were daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, and cartadivistas. Most people wanted a final photo of their loved one, especially children, because there was a high mortality rate during that time period for children. Photographers would go to the house, or the body would be cleaned, dressed, and transported to the photography studio. Most photos were taken in a natural pose. The loved one would be in a chair or on a bed. And these were called memento mori, which means remember thy death. In addition, family members were also photographed with a painting or picture of a loved one in the background, or them gazing at a locket containing the photo of the deceased. During this time period, spiritualism and the afterlife were a prominent theme. Spiritualism was the belief in the dead communicating with the living. In other words, communicating with the spirits of the dead. They did this via use of a sensitive or medium. In the 1850s, they would gather around a table, join hands, and attempted to contact the departed loved one in the hereafter. These were called seances. And seances would result in knockings, table tiltings, rappings, and objects and spirits floating across the room. There was also something called spirit photography. Spirits, the photographer would take a picture, and spirits would supposedly appear in the negative or print. Mary Todd Lincoln, for instance, was a very famous Victorian that practiced spiritualism. And there's a very famous photo of Mary Todd Lincoln, a spirit photo. You should look that up. I also, at one point, came across a very rare spirit photo. And at the time, I wasn't collecting. I'm an antiques and collectibles dealer. and I ran across the spirit photo of a man, and behind him were the spirits of his, I would assume his mother and father. These spirit photos run, when you sell them, $300, $500, up to like $2,000, especially the one with Mary Todd Lincoln in it. That's the top dollar spirit photo. So anyway, I had this photo that I ran across, and a very famous ghost hunter, whom I shall not name, collects spirit photos, and the person bought it from me. So now the photo that I had, the spirit photo, is in a very famous ghost hunter's private collection. Another thing that was done to remember the dead was mourning art. Another way of paying tribute to the dead. They would make needlework samplers. There'd be hair work pictures. This is where they would take real hair and put it on the art and in the art, whatever that medium was. There would also be paintings with images of weeping willows, gravestones, birds, flowers, angels, and grieving females. Death was the theme. Now, lastly, there's something called mourning jewelry. Mourning jewelry is made out of jet, gutta percha, black glass, onyx, vulcanite bog oak, and human hair. There would be brooches, lockets, necklaces, bracelets, and rings. They'd be engraved with names and important dates. And hair from the deceased would be used, either worked or just used and put in a locket, either, crocheted or something like that, which was called hair work, and or take a real piece of hair, a lock of hair of a loved one. And I actually have one from my collection that I brought. You probably can't see it very well from here, but this one is made out of brass, and it's a pin as well as a pendant. You can wear it either way. What's weird is that, and it's got a black border, but what's weird is there's a glass front on this, and inside there's hair. Now, this has obviously been around since the mid-1800s, so you can barely see the hair in there, but there's some hair. I tried to open this up, but I'd have to destroy it to open it up, so that's the best I can do. But, it's kind of creepy to have somebody's hair in that. So, Victorian mourning rituals were prominent for a 40-year period, from the death of Prince Albert in 1861 to the death of his beloved, Queen Victoria, in 1901. And after Queen Victoria's death, Victorian mourning rituals slowly vanished. So, I hope you learned some stuff about Victorian mourning rituals today, and thank you for watching the show. Until next time, peace out. That surrounds the sky and the trees, the birds and the manicured grounds. Welcome to my sleeping place, where I can rest in peace, where I can lay my head for eternity.
can lay my head for eternity. You can pray for me if that's what you need to do, but I'm quite fine waiting here for you. Welcome to my sleeping place, where I can rest in peace, where I can lay my head for eternity. Welcome to my sleeping place, where I can rest in peace, where I can lay my head for eternity.